On the morning of June 29, 1776, British sailors pulled alongside an American brigantine stranded in the shallows off New Jersey. The ship had stopped firing, her crew was gone, her flag had come down. To the men rowing out from HMS Kingfisher, it looked like the easiest prize they would take all day. The first sailors reached the hull, climbed aboard, and according to later accounts, cheered. They had no idea that somewhere inside the abandoned ship, fire was already moving toward nearly 100 barrels of gunpowder. Seconds later, the Nancy exploded. The blast tore through the vessel and killed British boarders who had believed they were stepping onto a surrendered ship. But the strangest part of the story is not that the Americans destroyed their own vessel. It is why so much powder was still aboard, why the British were willing to board so quickly, and why losing the Nancy could still count as an American success. Because by the time the British climbed onto that deck, the real battle had already been fought. And the ship was no longer the thing the Americans were trying to save. 24 hours earlier, the Nancy was still at sea. She was not a powerful Continental Navy warship built to challenge British frigates broadside for broadside. She was a merchant brigantine chartered by the Pennsylvania Committee of Safety and placed under Captain Hugh Montgomery. Her value was not in her guns, it was below deck. The American Revolution had produced an army faster than it had produced the industrial system needed to supply one. Muskets could be found, repaired, imported, or taken from private hands. Men could be recruited. But gunpowder was different. Without powder, a musket became little more than a club, and a cannon became several thousand pounds of useless iron. The colonies could manufacture some powder themselves, but not enough to remove dependence on overseas supply. That made the Caribbean extraordinarily important. Merchants and agents searched foreign ports for powder, weapons, cloth, medicine, and anything else that could keep the rebellion alive. The Nancy had gone south for exactly that reason. By June 1776, she was returning from St. Thomas and St. Croix, carrying a cargo that contemporary records valued far beyond the wooden hull transporting it. The most important item was 386 barrels of gunpowder. Other records list 50 firelocks, large quantities of rum and sugar, and additional supplies. And all of it was heading for Philadelphia. That made the entrance to Delaware Bay one of the worst places on the American coast for Montgomery to meet the Royal Navy. Britain did not need to occupy every American harbor to damage the rebellion. It could use the Royal Navy to patrol approaches, stop merchantmen, seize cargoes, and force American vessels into long detours or dangerous coastal passages. The Delaware mattered especially because the river led directly toward Philadelphia, where Congress sat and where military supplies could be distributed inland. Off Cape May, British warships watched the entrance. On June 28th, the Nancy was sighted. HMS Kingfisher and HMS Orpheus began the pursuit. That created a brutally simple problem for Montgomery. His ship could carry powder. It could not outfight the Royal Navy vessels behind him. If the British forced him to stop in open water, the operation was over. The Nancy would be captured, her crew taken prisoner, and hundreds of barrels of American gunpowder would become British property. The enemy would not merely deny those supplies to the Continental Army, it would take them for itself. But Cape May also contained something the British advantage in cannon could not completely erase. Shallow water. Inlets, shoals, shifting channels, sandbars, and coastal passages were dangerous to vessels that did not know them. Local pilots and smaller American craft could operate in water where larger British ships had to be more cautious. And near Cape May was a narrow opening called Turtle Gut Inlet. Today, that inlet no longer exists. It was eventually filled in, and the modern shoreline gives almost no sense that a naval fight once happened there. But in 1776, Turtle Gut offered Montgomery the one thing he desperately needed: a place where a doomed ship might still buy time. The Americans ashore already knew the Nancy was coming. John Barry, commanding the Continental brig Lexington, received word that Montgomery was being pursued. Barry had other American vessels nearby, including Reprisal under Lambert Wickes and Wasp under William Halleck. They could not simply sail out and drive away the Royal Navy. Their combined force was still operating under the guns of a much more powerful maritime enemy. So Barry did not try to turn the situation into the kind of battle Britain was built to win. He prepared boats. That distinction would decide what happened next. A ship's longboat could not trade broadsides with a British warship, but it could cross shallow water, it could carry men, and more importantly, it could carry cargo. During the night, armed boats moved toward the endangered Nancy. Lieutenant Richard Wicks, the brother of Captain Lambert Wicks, was among the officers taking part. Then came the fog, the chase, and the shoreline. In the early hours of June 29th, the Nancy moved toward Turtle Gut Inlet with British ships behind her. And she ran aground. For Montgomery, the worst possible thing had happened. A sailing vessel survives by movement. Once grounded under enemy guns, it cannot maneuver, cannot choose range, cannot escape if the enemy closes in. Every British cannonball now had a stationary target. The Nancy had become a 6-gun wooden warehouse filled with hundreds of barrels of explosive powder. But when Barry's men reached her, they did something that changed the logic of the entire fight. They stopped treating the ship as the objective. The cargo became the objective. Barry and the sailors coming to Montgomery's aid began a 2-part operation. Some men would keep the Nancy's guns working and resist British attempts to close. Others would go below deck, move the powder out of the hold, load it into boats, row it through the shallows, and carry it ashore. The hull could be sacrificed, the powder could not. This is where the Battle of Turtle Gut becomes much more interesting than the explosion that made it famous. The Americans were not going to sink Kingfisher. They were not going to capture Orpheus. They were not going to break the Royal Navy blockade with 6 guns on a grounded merchant brig. They were fighting for minutes. Every minute the British stayed back meant another boat could be loaded. Every boat meant more powder removed, and every barrel carried behind the dunes reduced the value of the prize Britain was about to capture. The British commanders had their own problem. Their warships possessed overwhelming firepower compared with the stranded Nancy, but the shallow coastal water limited how aggressively they could use the ships themselves. Sending the larger vessels straight into unknown shallows risked grounding them as well. So they could bombard, they could send smaller boats, and they could wait for damage to make American resistance impossible. This was not British incompetence, it was a limitation built into the environment. The Royal Navy's advantage was greatest in deep water, where trained crews, heavier batteries, stronger ships, and professional seamanship could dominate weaker opponents. Barry was trying to move the contest somewhere else, onto the boundary between sea and land. The British opened fire. Cannon shots struck around the stranded brig. Wood splintered. Rigging was damaged. Men aboard Nancy worked while the vessel was being progressively wrecked beneath them. Powder had to come out of storage. It had to be handled carefully. It had to be transferred into boats that were already operating under enemy fire. Then those boats had to reach shore, unload, and return. There was nothing glamorous about the mechanism. No brilliant cavalry charge, no perfectly timed bayonet assault. It was logistics performed while someone was shooting cannon at you. And that is precisely why it mattered. An army can survive the loss of one transport. It cannot fire ammunition that never arrives. Behind the dunes, local inhabitants helped move and secure what the sailors brought ashore. Then the boats went back again, and again. The Nancy continued firing enough to interfere with British attempts to rush the wreck. The longer that continued, the less useful the ship became as a target. By late morning, a surviving naval document recorded that 265 of the original 386 containers of powder had been taken ashore. Other later accounts put the quantity saved somewhat higher, around 280. The exact total varies with the source. The important fact is not. Most of the powder was no longer aboard, but roughly 100 barrels still were. And now, the operation reached the point where staying longer could destroy everything the Americans had already achieved. The Nancy was being battered apart. The men aboard were exposed. The British knew the stranded vessel could not escape. Sooner or later, continued bombardment or a successful boarding attempt would end the resistance. Barry therefore faced a decision that appears simple only when you already know how the story ends. Keep unloading or leave. Another trip might save more powder. Another trip might also give British shot enough time to kill the crews in the boats, smash the remaining defenses, or trap the Americans aboard. The ship itself was finished. The question was whether the men should be finished with it. And there was one more problem. If they simply abandoned Nancy, the British would still receive something valuable. They would get the vessel. They would get whatever equipment remained, and they would get nearly 100 barrels of powder sitting in the hold. The Americans had spent hours converting a catastrophic loss into a partial success. Walking away now would still hand Britain a dangerous reward, so the objective changed again. At first, they had tried to save Nancy. When that became impossible, they tried to save her cargo. Now that further unloading had become too dangerous, the task was to make sure the part they could not save could never be used by the enemy. That is the central mechanism of what happened at Turtle Gut. Not a hidden bomb placed on an innocent-looking ship days in advance. Not a carefully scripted false surrender. A real-time adaptation to a vessel that had already been lost. The Americans began preparing Nancy for destruction, and the way they did it was remarkably crude. They did not possess a modern demolition timer. They did not have electrical detonators or a shaped charge placed by specialists. According to the surviving accounts, roughly 50 pounds of gunpowder were spread or wrapped into the ship's mainsail. The sail was rolled tightly enough to form a long combustible train. That improvised fuse ran toward the powder that remained below deck. The Americans needed the fire to do two contradictory things: burn slowly enough for them to escape, but fast enough that the British would not have time to understand what they had captured. That balance was everything. Too fast and the Americans would blow themselves up. Too slow and British sailors could board, notice smoke or burning canvas, extinguish it, and save the prize. Barry and Montgomery were no longer fighting the British guns. They were now fighting time. The last boats were prepared, the men withdrew, then the fuse was lit. At this point, one detail transformed a demolition into one of the strangest traps of the Revolution. The American flag was still aboard. According to the traditional account preserved in local histories, one sailor remained behind long enough to retrieve it. He came down, reached the escaping boat, and the flag was lowered as the Americans pulled away. From the British position, the meaning seemed obvious. An enemy ship had run aground. It had been pounded by gunfire, its crew had left, and now its colors had come down. In 18th century naval warfare, lowering the flag was the unmistakable visual language associated with surrender. The British did not need to imagine a complicated deception. Everything they could see told them the fight was over. And there is an important difference here. The Americans may not have planned the lowered flag as bait. The evidence supports the sailor retrieving the colors and the British interpreting that action as surrender. That misunderstanding was enough. The Royal Navy had every reason to move quickly. A captured enemy vessel was a prize. Its remaining cargo could be recovered. Intelligence could be taken from papers or equipment. And if the Americans were already escaping toward shore, delay only gave them more time to organize resistance there. So longboats from Kingfisher pulled toward the abandoned brig. Behind them sat one of the most powerful naval systems in the world. Ahead of them sat a wreck that appeared to have finally submitted to it. The British began closing the distance. The Americans kept moving toward shore. And inside the Nancy, the burning sail continued carrying flame toward the hold. No one aboard the British boats could see the tactical equation that had changed over the previous hours. When the chase began, the Nancy had been worth capturing. When she grounded, she had been worth defending. After most of her powder went ashore, she became expendable. Once the fuse was lit, she became dangerous to possess. The British were approaching the same object, but it was no longer the same military target. The Royal Navy had trained men to recognize surrender. The Americans had accidentally given them almost every visual signal they expected to see. Abandoned deck, silenced guns, departing crew, lowered colors. There was no reason for the sailors in those boats to assume that the wreck in front of them had become a giant powder charge. The British were not rushing toward an obvious trap because they were careless. They were rushing toward what looked exactly like the result they had spent the morning creating. Their bombardment had stopped the enemy. Their quarry could no longer move. Its defenders were leaving. The prize was theirs. That confidence was about to become the final component of the American demolition. The first British sailors reached the Nancy. The longboats came alongside. Men climbed up onto the damaged brig. Later, local accounts say the first 7 sailors aboard raised a cheer. For them, the dangerous part was over. The Americans had fled. The ship had been taken. Instead, fire reached the powder. There was no warning large enough to matter. The Nancy exploded. Nearly 100 barrels of gunpowder remaining below deck detonated in a wooden ship already shattered by hours of cannon fire. The hull became fragments. Timbers, rigging, iron, smoke, and burning wreckage were thrown outward over the inlet. The men standing on the prize disappeared with it. What is documented is the loss aboard the British boarding force. Captain Alexander Graham of Kingfisher reported the death of his master's mate and 6 men associated with the boats. 7 men. This was not a victory because the explosion annihilated a major British formation. It did not. The decisive thing was what Britain failed to capture. The Nancy was destroyed. But she was already lost. Most of the gunpowder was not. The British had used warships to chase an American transport into the shallows. They had bombarded it until it could not escape. In the conventional sense, they had won the contest for the vessel. Yet when the operation ended, the British had neither the ship nor most of its cargo. The Americans had separated those two things in time. First, save what matters. Then destroy what cannot be saved. That is what turned defeat into denial. But the explosion did not end the danger instantly. The British ships were still offshore. The Americans were still exposed near the beach, and this small victory carried a real cost. Lieutenant Richard Wicks had gone out in the armed boats to help reach the Nancy. He was the brother of Lambert Wicks, captain of the Continental brig Reprisal. The brothers had entered Continental naval service during the same young war, and now Richard was fighting within sight of Lambert's command. During the closing stage of the action, Richard Wicks was struck by British cannon fire and killed. He became the first American military fatality of the Revolutionary War in New Jersey. Later, he would be buried at Cold Spring Presbyterian Cemetery near Cape May. His death matters because it prevents the explosion from becoming a clean little story about British sailors being fooled by a clever trick. The Americans had been operating under real naval gunfire for hours. They were taking an irreplaceable military supply out of a ship while professional British crews tried to stop them. One American officer did not make it back, and the British sailors who died aboard Nancy were also casualties of a decision that, from their position, was completely rational. Both sides acted according to the information and tools available to them. Britain had superior naval power. The Americans had local access, small boats, a grounded transport, and a limited amount of time. They could not reverse the balance of power, so they changed what success meant. Barry did not need to defeat the Royal Navy. He needed to keep the Royal Navy away from the cargo long enough to move it. Montgomery did not need his vessel to survive. He needed the mission behind the vessel to survive. Why accept the grounding of a powder ship near the beach? Because deep water meant capture, while shallow water created a chance to unload. Why keep firing from a ship that could not escape? Because the guns were buying time, not victory. Why leave roughly 100 barrels aboard? Because eventually the cost of another unloading cycle became greater than the value of what might be saved. Why blow up the vessel? Because a lost asset does not have to become an enemy asset. And why did the British board? Because every visible sign suggested that their pressure had worked. The trap did not depend on Britain becoming incompetent. It depended on Britain believing a reasonable thing at exactly the wrong moment. The ship looked defeated. The mission was not. And there is another detail that makes the timing extraordinary. This happened on June 29, 1776, 5 days before the Continental Congress adopted the Declaration of Independence. The political break with Britain was reaching its most famous moment, but along the American coast, independence still depended on much less dramatic problems. Could a ship get through a blockade? Could ammunition cross an ocean? Could men unload it before a frigate destroyed them? Could an army obtain enough powder to keep firing? Those questions do not appear on paintings of the Declaration. But without the answers, declarations mean very little on a battlefield. The saved powder was eventually moved onward through the Delaware system toward the American war effort. The Nancy herself would never sail again. Imagine 2 columns on a ledger. In the British column, the enemy transport has been driven ashore and destroyed. In the American column, hundreds of barrels of powder have escaped capture. The enemy gets neither the usable ship nor the remaining powder, and the blockade force has been forced to spend hours and ammunition to obtain a wreck. Both statements can be true, but only one asks what the original mission was. The Nancy had not sailed from the Caribbean because America needed another wooden hull in Philadelphia. She had sailed because America needed what was inside it. The hull was transportation. The powder was combat power. That principle appears across military history. An army destroys bridges after crossing them. A retreating force burns stores it cannot carry. Crews scuttle ships that are about to be captured. The physical object and the military purpose are not always the same thing. The Royal Navy remained enormously dangerous. It would continue to blockade, raid, and pressure American commerce for the rest of the war. The British would later occupy Philadelphia itself. One exploding brigantine did not suddenly make the Americans masters of the sea. But the weaker side survives by repeatedly denying the stronger side the clean victory its advantages are supposed to produce. Britain could control open water. It could not control every inlet at every moment. It could bring heavier guns. Those guns could not unload a captured cargo already carried behind the dunes. A stronger force can win every visible exchange and still fail at the thing that matters most. 250 years later, Turtle Gut Inlet itself is gone. The waterway was filled in during the 20th century. Houses, roads, and a small memorial now occupy a landscape where sailors once hauled powder through surf and smoke. A blockade created the trap. Shallow water limited the stronger force. Small boats preserved mobility. Covering fire purchased minutes. Those minutes saved most of the powder. The remaining powder destroyed the asset that could no longer be saved. And a perfectly understandable British assumption brought the boarding party aboard before the fire reached the hold. Britain had the bigger ships, the bigger guns, the professional navy. The Americans had one stranded brigantine they could no longer keep. So they stopped trying to keep it. And that decision was the reason the Nancy could be destroyed without the mission being destroyed with her. If you want more American Revolution stories where the real explanation is not simply who had more men or more guns, subscribe. And tell me in the comments, what actually decided Turtle Gut, the shallow water that kept the Royal Navy at distance, Barry's decision to save the powder instead of the ship, or the British decision to treat the abandoned Nancy as a normal prize?